Welcome back, everyone, from our break. I hope that was refreshing. And I am now honored to introduce our closing keynote speaker to you all. Dr. Mustafa Santiago Ali is a member of the HCS National Advisory Committee and is the National Wildlife Federation's Vice President of Environmental Justice, Climate, and Community Revitalization. Before joining the National Wildlife Federation, he was a senior vice president for the Hip Hop Caucus, a national nonprofit and nonpartisan organization that connects the hip hop community to the civic process to build power and create positive change. Dr. Ali also worked at EPA for 24 years, advising the agency on environmental justice issues. Dr. Ali, the stage is yours.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you to all the incredible leaders who have been a part of this event for over the last 2 days. Thank you so much for the work that you've done in good times and in challenging times. We've all been there before. And this is a transformational moment. And I'm sure over the last 2 days, you've realized the immense set of opportunities that we have in front of us to make real change happen. And in this transformational moment, we also have to anchor it in the fact of some of the challenges that we faced and also our North Star moving forward. I would be remiss if I didn't also honor our indigenous brothers and sisters whose land I reside on, the Pamunkey and the Mattaponi, and thank them also for playing such a critical role in the development of the principles of environmental justice. Those 17 principles that if we had been following those since the creation of our country, or maybe even before, that we would find ourselves in a much better position. The first principle of the environmental justice movement is about honoring Mother Earth. I want you all to just take a moment and think about how different our policies would be, how different our interactions would be with each other if we actually honored that first principle of the environmental justice movement, and how different our history would be. Many of you are very well versed on the challenges that have happened and continue to happen in the environmental space, in the public health space, in the housing space, in the transportation space, and in the economic space. And we know that policy is a strong driver there. Lots of times people will ask us a question, we'll say, well, let me check the policy of my organization. Policy played a role in placing us in the situations that we find ourselves in. I come out of a faith-based family, and we often, are raised on understanding, the sins that are responsible for many of the negative things that happen sometimes in our lives. I often talk about in the policy context, and I know it may not be scientific, or it may not be the most politically astute way of addressing or framing an issue, but I talk about hopefully we won't repeat them. It was policy that actually moved our indigenous brothers and sisters off of their traditional lands and placed them in the most least desirable locations in many, many instances. It was policy that took them away from their traditional foods. It was policy that also co-signed on the genocide and the millions and millions and millions of lives that have been lost by our indigenous brothers and sisters. It was policy that did that, policy that was signed off on by the United States government. It was policy also that said that it was okay to go to Africa to kidnap folks and bring them back to this country for free labor. It was policy that did that. And we should be very clear as we're trying to help to dismantle systemic racism and understanding how it was a driver in both of those sets of actions. It was policy that also said that women shouldn't have the right to vote, that they shouldn't be able to own land, and that their voices didn't matter. That was policy in a negative context that actually did that. It was also policy that justified, actually doing some negative things in relationship to our Japanese brothers and sisters and placing them in internment camps while others were allowed to walk around free, whose countries of origin were also at war with our country. It was policy that did that. So if we understand that policy can be damaging, we also then understand that policy can be flipped, that policy can be infused with positive energy, with actions and accountability to help make real change happen. Because when we don't do that, we get things like Jim Crow laws. And yes, we still see the reverberation of those even today with many of the actions that we've seen going on around people having and it being a fair and equitable process. And also understanding that because there have been disparities, that we have to be doing everything that we can to get people more engaged in the civic process. I don't never tell anybody who to vote for, but I do say vote for somebody who cares about your community. Vote for somebody who cares about, the things that are going on inside of your lives. And when we understand that policy has done many of these things, like allowed certain soldiers to come back from war and be able to access housing and resources to help them to build a strong structure underneath of them, which we understand also plays into the public health realm that I'll talk more about. And that Black soldiers, when they came home, that they weren't allowed to be able to receive the benefits that all men and women who have fought for this country deserve. But we also know that when men and women of good conscience come together, that we can make some real change actually happen. And I know it's been talked about over the last couple of days. It was policy also when the women's suffrage movement began to become focused and to build coalitions and to point out a better direction. Eventually, policy began to kick in. And yes, we still have a long way to go to make sure that women are truly honored and that there's real equity in that system, that there's equal pay for equal work and all the other things that are so critically important. And we also understand that policy helped us to make sure that, we had the constitutional amendments to actually give Black folks, some basic rights, basic amenities, if you will, whether we're talking about in the housing space, the accommodation space, being able to vote, and a number of other things that many of you are very aware of. And we also understand that in the environmental context, policies, both on the federal level and the state level, and inside of our respective institutions, has also been put in place and in some instances actually hurt communities. And in other instances has began to build a social safety net, if you will, to address some of the challenges that still continue to happen. And we know that if it wasn't for Air Act or the Clean Water Act or RCRA or a number of these other acts that in the environmental context are so critically important, but we also know there were gaps that existed inside of them. And yes, there has been discrimination, there's been biases, there's been a number of these other things that place people in a more dangerous situation. If we want to have an honest conversation about public health and an honest conversation about the environment and climate, and how systemic racism has played a negative role in how we are rebuilding and revamping systems to make sure that that is no longer the narrative, then we have to call out the fact that we've got some responsibility in that space. That many of our foundations, that many of our conservation organizations and others, unfortunately, some played a negative role and others had a hands-off role, which allowed many of these injustices that many of us now work on. And then understanding because of those injustices, the public health impacts that have played out. And we also know that policy can play a role in helping to make sure that we're addressing the 24 million folks in our country who are living in physician deserts and medically underserved areas. And how when folks are dealing with the impacts from pollution, when they're dealing with the impacts from systemic racism and the mental stressors and a number of other things that are a part of that, when you don't have access, then it makes you doubly and sometimes triply vulnerable when you begin to overlay many of these things. And some people might be saying, well, Mustafa, what do you mean when you're referencing the impacts of policy in relationship to some of our conversations that have gone on earlier and what we're talking about right now? I've been blessed to be surrounded and to work with some of the best scientists around the world on a number of different issues. And sometimes folks want to have conversations about parts per billion and parts per million, which are important in certain contexts. But when we're talking with everyday folks folks that I've worked with, Mrs. Ramirez and Mr. Johnson, and sometimes Mr. O'Leary and a number of others, then you have to bring it back down to the ground about what's really going on in everyday people's lives. You know, in our country right now, we have 100,000 people who are dying prematurely from air pollution. I want you to think about that for a second. And all the work that all of us do, 100,000 people are dying prematurely from air pollution. More people are dying from air pollution than are dying from gun violence. And we know how critically important that is. And when those of us who work underneath of a paradigm of the social determinants of health, we understand the various pieces that come together for these types of disparities and these types of negative actions that happen. We got more people dying right now from air pollution than are dying from car crashes. And I bet you if I could see everyone who's on the call today, and if I asked you to raise your hand, everyone knows someone who's been impacted from car crashes and someone who's been impacted from gun violence. And we've even got more people who are dying in relationship to air pollution. Y'all do me a quick favor. I know we only have a short amount of time together today, but do me a favor. Take a deep breath in and hold it just for a second. Now let it out. You know, it's an autonomic response. We know that we do it multiple times a day, and we assume that something good is going to come into our bodies when we do that. But we know we have far too many locations across our country where that's not a reality. And we know that, you know, in our country that we've got places like Houston, Texas. Now, many of you have probably been to Houston. Probably fewer have been to the Ship Channel, and even fewer maybe have been to the Manchester community. It's hardworking Latinx community, folks trying the best of their ability to do everything right. There's an iconic photo of Cesar Chavez High School. Cesar Chavez High School has a track. And in that iconic photo, you will also see in the back of that school, the flaring that's going on from the facilities that are not too far away. I know many of you work on issues in relationship to children and understand the impacts that are going on. When you go to the Manchester community, on many days, you roll down the windows of your car. If you have an old car, you roll them down. Some of y'all get to press the button. But the reality is, when you take in that first breath of air that we just did a second ago, that people literally feel like they're breathing in gasoline fumes. Imagine kids being expected to learn in that type of an atmosphere. Imagine kids being expected to thrive in that type of an atmosphere. Imagine kids having to live in that type of an atmosphere. And of course, our elders are impacted and everybody else who falls in between. You have places like Port Arthur, Texas, further down the Gulf Coast, that once was a thriving African-American community, but now, for as far as the eye can see, they have petrochemical facilities. The culture has been eroded. Public health impacts are off the charts for a number of different diseases. And of course, whether you're in the Manchester community or if you're in Port Arthur, Texas, the emissions that are coming out of those plants that have been making Black and brown folks sick for decades now are also playing a significant role in the warming up of our oceans and warming up of our planet, placing additional burdens on these communities who have never done anything to contribute to the things that are going on in that space. If you want to go further across the Gulf Coast, you can go to an area that many of you at least have heard about in the press, and that's Cancer Alley. Some of the highest cancer rates in the country. You know, an area founded by freed slaves. And again, for as far as the eye can see, you see nothing but facilities, and people have also been disinvested in. In all of these communities that I will reference, you'll see another dynamic that's going in, where people have taken away people's rights. They've disinvested in those communities, and then the negative comes in. Many of you have heard the phrase of your zip code determining how long you will live. These are just some of the examples of communities that are dealing with these types of issues. In our country right now, you know, we've got 28 million kids who are living with unhealthy air. How is that possible in the wealthiest country in the world, that we would even allow that dynamic to go on, that we wouldn't do everything in our power to rectify that? I mean, some of the decisions that were made in the past, of course, people just didn't have the science. But we know better. My grandmother says, when you know better, do better. When you know better, do better. So there's no reason for us to allow these types of situations to continue to go on. And of course, they're not just issues that are going on in the South. They are also issues that are happening in Appalachia. They're happening on our coast. And people are doing everything that they can to make real change happen. And that's why all of us, our organizations, and so many others have got to play an even stronger critical role. There is a cultural shift that is happening in our country right now. And there are a number of different factors that are helping to put a spotlight on the injustices that are happening, the work that each and every one of you have been doing that has been difficult in many times because you couldn't get the resources. You couldn't get people to pay attention. You couldn't get accountability built into the processes that were necessary. We hadn't fully supported citizen science and traditional environmental knowledge, which is a part of the science paradigm if you are willing to create a 21st century paradigm, one where it honors everyone and those sets of experiences. And that when we're doing research, that research is driven by the things that communities are asking for. Imagine shifting the paradigm away from, we got this grant, and this grant gives us the opportunity to do X, Y, and Z, to we've got this because we are truly creating authentic partnerships with communities. And this is what they're asking for. And I know, because I know many of the presenters, and I know many of you who are on the line today, that you understand that dynamic, but we have a responsibility to make sure that that becomes integrated into the work that everyone is doing across the country. If we are funders driving that point home, we should be building that into the accountability mechanisms and to what we are asking for from a recipient. And it will be a game changer if we began to do that in a very holistic way. Y'all do me a favor. I'm just going to ask you a quick question. In the last 24 hours, how many folks have had a drink of water or a beverage? And there may be some folks who are standing back next to you or actually watching you raise your hand. It's interesting that in our country right now, and why our work is so critically important, we've got 60 million folks right now who have dealt with unhealthy or unsafe drinking water. We've got 2.1 million folks who are not even hooked up to sewer systems and who are not hooked up to water systems. Once again, and I want to anchor this with folks, we're talking about the wealthiest country in the world to have these types of dynamics that are going on. We've got places like Sand Branch, Texas, outside of Dallas, who for decades have been trying to get hooked up to water, but people making policy decisions deciding that they were not valuable enough to make the investments in. You got places like Denmark, South Carolina, where people have had unsafe and unhealthy drinking water for decades now. You've got places like Lowndes County, Alabama, places that maybe some of y'all have never had the opportunity to visit. In Lowndes County, Alabama, Catherine Flowers in her new book really brings it home. You got folks walking around in human waste. And you've got tropical diseases that are happening because of these situations and these sets of exposures that are going on in the wealthiest country in the world. But it's about prioritization, because we know these types of dynamics never happen in wealthy communities, but they do happen in communities of color, in lower wealth white communities. And they also happen, of course, when you go to many of the reservations across our country, folks don't have access to water, or they have to travel great distances to be able to get it, or it's not healthy because the infrastructure has not been built. How do we allow that in the wealthiest country in the world? When you go to Appalachia, a place that I spent time growing up in, and because of the impacts that have been happening from mining and a number of other things, people don't have safe drinking water in far too many instances. And we know our brothers and sisters who find themselves trying to help to support the country by, working in the agricultural world, especially those who have been farm workers. We've seen the dynamics that each and every one of them and the exposures from pesticides, but also in limited access to safe, clean water. And I'll just share with you also places like Detroit, Michigan, once a thriving and still a beautiful city with an amazing culture. People there losing their homes because of the escalating prices that have been going on in relationship to water. And of course, we all know what happened in Flint, Michigan. But we also should realize that we've got 1.2 million kids in our country who have been suffering from lead. And we've got over 3,000 locations across our country that have higher levels of lead in their water than Flint, Michigan did, in the wealthiest country in the world. And each and every one of us have a responsibility to make sure that the injustices that I've been referencing don't become a part of the narrative as we move forward. We have the power to actually make real change happen. The question is, are we willing to lean in even further? And I know many of you are saying, well, Mustafa, I've been doing what I can, 10 years, some folks for decades. This is a transformational moment where we get a chance to actually change the dynamics that have been going on. And if we don't, then it's our fault. It's our fault because we also understand that if many of the things that I just referenced, if we can get those right, we still have the overlay of the climate crisis that's going to bring an additional set of challenges. But we also understand that there are opportunities that are also a part of that paradigm. We've all read the IPCC reports and the National Climate Assessment reports, and we understand that there are going to be more significant forest fires that are going to happen, that there are going to be stronger hurricanes, these extreme rain events and the floods that we've continued to see, and a number of other things related to heat and the impacts that will happen in that space. We know that we've got to make sure that, one, we're building the infrastructure, and that infrastructure has got to take new and different directions than the traditional infrastructure. There's a big set of conversations that are happening right now on Capitol Hill about how do you define what the sets of opportunities are for infrastructure. Well, if you're living in a country where you know that clinics and hospitals in the rural context and the urban context have been shutting down, and we've seen the disparities because of the pandemic that have put a spotlight on that, and we know the communities that that's happening in, then we should be giving strong consideration to making sure that that's a part of the infrastructure we're talking about. We're not just talking about roads and bridges. We're talking about waste treatment facilities. We're talking about getting those lead pipes out of the water, because we understand the public health impacts that our most vulnerable communities have been dealing with, the cancer clusters that have existed, the liver and kidney diseases, the breathing difficulties, all of these different types of things that actually extract wealth from the communities that are being impacted. And when you really understand context, makes our country weaker and less strong from an economic positioning because of not making the proper investments in the places and spaces that have needed them the most. And we can unpack that when we have our broader set of conversation here in a minute. I would be remiss if I didn't say that even with these challenges that are going on, this set of North Stars that exist from the new administration, I think that we should give them credit for beginning to build an infrastructure around environmental justice by having, the WEJAC that's there now, by looking at how do we leverage the interagency sets of opportunities that exist to make sure that, one, the capacity and the resources are making it to the people who need them the most and where the most good can actually happen. And that happens in the spaces that have been forgotten for far too long. We can help people move from surviving to thriving. And people have already been doing that. You have individuals and organizations like the Regenesis Project in Spartanburg, South Carolina. If you all haven't had a chance to check out that project, you definitely should, because it is one of the templates that will be necessary moving forward. Because, they took a $20,000 environmental justice small grant and have now leveraged it into $300 million in changes. Imagine if you played the stock market and you made a $20,000 investment and it ended up turning into $300 million. Everyone around the country would be following you around, asking you how you did that. Ask yourself the question, why is it that something that has that level of success is not in everyone's playbook. I wonder what the dynamic is of why that might be. And we can unpack that in a little while. You know, with the Regenesis Project, it hits many, each and every one of you care about. And I know that it also addresses many of the challenges that I've seen in the 700 plus communities that I've worked in across this country. You know, it deals with old shotgun housing. And for those of you who spend any time in the South, you know what that means. You open up the front door, you can see out the back door, not a lot of insulation that's going in. You know, folks there were paying $300 to $400 a month for their electricity costs. And now we've gotten 500 new green homes and lowered their electricity costs from $300 to $400 a month down to $65 a month. For some folks, that's a big deal because it puts more dollars into folks who maybe are on a limited income into their pockets. It got a new 60,000 square foot green community center, but a place where young people get to come and be in a safe atmosphere and a place where our elders come. So there's that intergenerational sets of activities that are going on so that we don't lose the wisdom of our elders and we embrace the ingenuity and innovation of young people. You know, it's a place where they were medically underserved. Seniors had to get on a bus and sometimes travel 20, 30 minutes to get to healthcare. Now they got 5 healthcare centers and a mobile healthcare unit that makes it out to the areas and places where folks don't have a car and they can't get there. And it also has hired folks who are there. And they're moving forward on green energy to make sure that the energy that's being utilized in this space is not contributing either to the climate crisis or to some of the other things that are going on there in the community. They've dealt with the food justice issues and gotten new supermarkets in, and other businesses have built around that. So there's lots of economic strength that's going on in that space. And here's the most important aspect of this is that the community, they are the center of this project. They're the ones who came up with the idea of the things that they wanted to address that were the negative impacts, like the brownfields and Superfund sites, and also what their vision was. It was the community that was the center. It's a different model than some folks operate from, where the city or the county, and then they invite the community in. You see, we're talking about community-driven sets of actions, which are so critical here in the 21st century to actually being authentic in the work that goes on in that space. And now they've cleaned up the brownfield sites and they're putting in a solar farm, which will zero out people's electricity costs. And a number of other advanced manufacturing and other businesses are going to be moving in, which will further help to make sure that folks have this stronger foundation underneath of them. And of course, we're remiss in our conversations when we don't talk about the voting process. And folks there realized that they needed to get engaged in the civic process, because if not, they were getting the crumbs from the table. So they got folks on the city council and the county commission, and eventually Harold Mitchell, who's the executive director of the Regenesis Project, into the state house. Got the first solar bill passed in South Carolina with Harold and Reverend Pickney. And yes, y'all remember Reverend Pickney. He was one of the folks when Dylan Ruth came into that church in South Carolina and killed the folks. He was one of the folks who was there. So that's just one example. You have all these incredible folks that we have to uplift as we're looking at this new design, this new set of opportunities. You have Derek Evans in Turkey Creek, and they've leveraged about $20 million in changes there and protected traditional housing that was there that was built by freed slaves, and a number of other things that they've been doing around water quality and making sure that the creeks that are there, which have been a part of the history of people being baptized and all these other types of actions, are being honored and respected in that space. You have Miss Margaret May in Kansas City, who cleaned up the crack houses and got new green space into the area and made sure that there's this vibrancy that's happening. Or if you come from a faith-based background, the work of Reverend Buster Suarez in Jersey City, or Reverend Floyd Flake up in Jamaica, Queens, or the incredible work that's been going on in Chicago by New Bethel. There are all these examples of Black and brown and indigenous folks who have been doing transformational work, but the platforms weren't there and the spotlight wasn't placed on this incredibly important sets of work to make real change happen. And I would just close out with this by saying that we now have a number of opportunities that are happening in relationship to the infrastructure bill and our stimulus bills and a number of other things that now place the resources with the great ideas that each and every one of you have had to make real change happen. Dr. King said that we come to these shores in different ships, but we're all in the same boat now. We're all in the same boat, even though there are different impacts that are happening in relationship to systemic racism. It affects all of us. We're all in the same boat in relationship to the pandemic. Yes, certain groups are dying at higher rates, but we all know that everyone can be impacted. And of course, we're all in the same boat when it comes to this climate crisis. I look forward to engaging with each and every one of you all. I want to thank you so much for a few moments of your time. And I want to thank you for the incredible work that I know many of you have been doing for decades.
Great. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, Dr. Ali. We now have about 15 minutes for Q&A. So our first question is, can you please speak to ways you've seen Black and Indigenous communities come together to fight inequities and address climate through collective power building?
Well, it's happening. It's been happening. The environmental justice that of Black and Brown and Indigenous and lower wealth white communities coming together because there wasn't not only a seat at the table, but the resources were not there. So we see it play out in so many different ways. And our pipeline fights that have been going on. When you take a look, you know, there are a number of different brothers and sisters who have been a part of that work. Today in the Byhalia pipeline fights, there was a bunch of folks who came together to stop the Atlantic Coast Pipeline in Union Hill, another community that was founded by freed slaves. So you see those dynamics that have gone on. And, you know, let's just go to the Black Lives Matter rallies that have been going on. You know, when you turn on the TV, you see America standing there and saying that the 21st century is going to look different and that we are going to stand in unity together to make real change happen. So it is happening. And that is one of the things that scares folks also. They used to be able to pit people against each other. And now it doesn't matter what your background is, brothers and sisters are coming together and saying change can and will happen.
Great, thank you so much. Our next question is, I appreciate the emphasis on the role policy often plays in driving and reinforcing inequities. What advice would you give to Black and Brown communities who have lost political will or don't trust systems?
Mm. Well, I get not trusting systems, but the reality is that that is a part of our process here. We have to dismantle and deconstruct systems that are not helpful to our communities, and that one means that we've got to get engaged in the civic process. And I often tell folks, if you can't find somebody who represents what you believe in and doesn't represent someone who cares about your community, then you have a responsibility to run for yourself. We can no longer sit on the sidelines and wait for someone to come and save us. And we also have a responsibility because these systems run because investments in them. So we have to make sure that we are calling out and that we are holding folks accountable for them propping up antiquated systems. And that means that, you know, we have to work with our foundations and make sure that they're building the right accountability measures in. We've got to make sure that corporations hear from us and know that we will no longer support those that, you know, are funding. I don't want to say our demise, but I do want to say funding the impacts that are happening in our communities. We have so much more power than sometimes that we realize. We have the power of the purse. We have the power of our vote. We have the power that exists, of course, through protest. We have the power by educating ourselves on the laws and making sure that we are working diligently to change the laws. So there are a number of different ways that we can show power. And we can also show power because each and every one of us walks around with a computer, either in our purse or our pocket every day, that we are actually documenting what's going on and sharing it with the world. And the world will also push to make sure that that change is happening. So we have to bring all these pieces together. And then, of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't also say that when we see organizations that don't look like America, then we have to push for that change. And what I mean by that real quickly is that if your boards don't look like America, 40% of America right now is people of color, then you are out of step. If your senior management doesn't look like America, you are out of step. If your organization is not making investments in our most vulnerable communities, then you're out of step. So all of this comes together for us to make system change.
Excellent. Our next question is, what does it look like to acknowledge and rectify historic and systemic racism in order to be able to advance climate action?
Well, first thing we have to call out is that we can't win on climate change if we don't win on environmental justice. Now, a lot of folks are finally evolving and understanding that. But many of the things that I talked about were drivers in the climate crisis. So if we're not going to get to the root causes, then we're going to have a very difficult time in hitting many of the goals that will just, help to make it a livable planet. So we know that the majority of the fossil fuel facilities are located in communities of color. We know that the infrastructure stuff, the pipelines, we got 2.6 million miles of pipeline in our country. And if you saw recently how everybody freaked out when the Colonial Pipeline had its, what was going on with it, and our transportation routes, all of this has had systemic racism built into it to separate communities and the various things that we know have gone on in that space. And our housing, we can no longer allow people to put housing in floodplains and next to these dangerous situations around these plants and other types of things. So we start there, and then we begin to also unpack these organizations that are the leading voices in the policy development and where resources go. And if we begin to have the right people in those organizations, then that's a part of the equation. But the other part of the equation, which is a bit more difficult for some folks, is that you have to fund frontline organizations. And when you do that and you get this whole mix together, then you begin to take a couple of the steps in the right direction. Of course, the other part of it is education, education, education. But we got to change that dynamic. I wish we had more time to unpack some of this, but you see, there's a reason why we haven't had the success that we would hope to have, whether in the climate space or the environmental space, the housing space, and the public health space. And sometimes it's about our messaging, our branding, and the education, because it has to be consistent, but it has to come from the people who are living these sets of experiences for it to have authenticity. And when we don't do that, I think we make our job so much harder. And that also means that we've got to share power. Now think about this real quickly. How many of you were taught about power in elementary school? I already know the answer. And how many folks were took a class on power in high school? Sometimes it's not until you get to college, if you're lucky at all, that anybody ever really teach you about power. So we have to really help a huge amount of people to understand what power is, what it looks like, and how we change the dynamic. Because power doesn't have to be a negative, but it does have to be rooted in positive change.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, how do we bridge the urban and rural divide when addressing climate equity and health issues?
Well, we have to honor the fact that there are some similarities, but there are also some differences, right? And sometimes folks, I don't know why sometimes people get nervous about that. The reality of the situation is that when we talk about lots of times folks in the rural spaces don't necessarily see themselves represented as a part of this new economy. And we have a distinct responsibility to help folks who maybe worked in the fossil fuel world or the industries to understand that there's a space and a place for them in this new economy. And that they can continue to put food on the table. They can continue to save money for their kids to be. They can continue to pay them dollars away. But sometimes we demonize folks. Folks have used demonization against different groups throughout the history of our country to separate folks. When we talk about these impacts that are happening from air pollution, and lots of times we'll think about urban centers and we'll think about traffic, and we'll fail to share with folks that 90% of our national parks are dealing with significant air pollution and impacts from the climate crisis. And we know that in the rural contexts around agriculture and a number of other issues that are playing a role also in some of the warming up of the planet that's going on, that we can create these sets of opportunities around natural infrastructure and getting people opportunities in that space. And when I go back home, to Appalachia, or if I'm back home in Michigan, I'm talking about advanced manufacturing opportunities, whether I'm talking about for folks who are in a more of a rural background or folks who are in a more urban background. People can get their mind around that. And then we have that conversation about these new sets of jobs. They also help to play a role in helping us to address the climate emergency that we find ourselves in. So once again, we have to change the paradigm and change the conversation so that we are honoring your sets of experiences with sets of solutions. And then you have to actually share with folks how and where that's actually happening with communities who look like them. Because I can't go to Appalachia and have a conversation going on in California, because that is not, that's not a connection point for folks in Appalachia. But if I can talk to them about these examples that are happening in Tennessee, or these examples that are happening in South Carolina, that's a little bit closer to home and people can get that. I think that's where we begin to make progress. And again, representation matters. You've got to have folks who are coming from and look like what you're talking about.
Excellent points. We have time for one or two more questions. New research shows that the pandemic might have been avoided if the world had acted a month earlier. How do we capitalize as an urgent lesson for climate change?
It's tragic as the pandemic has been, and I've lost a lot of family, unfortunately, to the virus. My family lost the first person to die in West Virginia from the virus. It's personal for me. But I also understand how it has placed a spotlight on the disparities that have gone on and how it helps some folks who never saw themselves being in a undervalued position, or not being able to access the resources that they traditionally have been able to. For those of us who work in the food justice and the food insecurity space, for a lot of folks in our country, they could never see themselves not being able to go to the grocery store and pick up whatever they wanted whenever they wanted to. And now we've seen these long lines of folks trying to get to food banks or trying to do these food pickups. And people are better understanding why we need to be focusing on food insecurity issues. We've also found that people didn't really understand these medical disparities that were going on, these medically underserved areas, or not being able to get to see a doctor when you needed to. And the pandemic made that real of why we need to be making these investments, but also people to understand that there have been biases in the system of where and why some Black and brown and indigenous brothers and sisters might be resistant to going to the doctor. And then, of course, all these conspiracy stuff that's been going on as well. So there are all these different areas. I could literally unpack each and every one of these for you, of where people are now beginning to better understand why we need to have a stronger healthcare system in our country, why we need to have broadband so that everybody, if you have to use telemedicine or if you have to work from home. And then also it's been put front and center how dangerous it actually is to be a frontline worker, whether you're in that medical space or if you're in the food space or if you're the person who was driving the bus or the subway or a number of other things that we can call out, and why you should be paid a living wage for the jobs that you're doing as a minimum. So this has all become more apparent to folks, along with some of the other disparities, because folks were, I don't want to say they were trapped at home, but they were home. They had slowed down for a second, and things began to actually resonate in a much deeper way than they ever had before. when folks saw, what happened to brother George Floyd, and then they saw these other stories, because folks had finally slowed down, they said, wait a minute, something has to change. And then some of us began to also share with folks, well, that air pollution plays a role in violence. It plays a role in some of these other things that have been impacting communities. So you are able to start to make these intersections for folks. And that is the moment that the pandemic has brought. With all the tragedy, there have been these opportunities for growth.